This is Tony Ulwick here with us at the beautiful Grand Hotel in Stockholm. Tony's the founder of Strategin and also the man behind outcome-driven innovation, which is the process for turning jobs to be done theory into practice. My name is Andy Kars. I'm the founder of Lean Ventures. It's a strategy innovation consultancy here in Stockholm. And with me I have my colleague Anders.
I'm Anders Ångström from A-Focus. We're B2B customer insight people.
And I think what unites Anders and I is our keen interest in jobs to be done theory, and perhaps in particular outcome-driven innovation, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So, welcome so much, Tony, to Stockholm. I know you've been here before, but last time the weather wasn't so good. So
much better this time.
Much better this time.
Yes.
If it's okay with you, perhaps we can start by you briefly introducing what is jobs to be done and what is outcome-driven innovation and how you came to develop ODI in the first place.
Sure. Well, I'll start with how we developed ODI because that happened before jobs theory came into play.
Right.
So I was working at IBM at the time, and I worked on a product called the PC Junior, which was quite a failure in the marketplace. And unfortunately, it was announced that way in the Wall Street Journal the day after we introduced it. So when you work on a product for a year and a half and see it fail and have it announced publicly to the world, it's pretty embarrassing. So the thought was, how did they know that it was a failure? Right? There was something that went wrong. How do we prevent that from happening again? And it occurred to me months later that whoever was evaluating our product was evaluating against some metrics that we didn't have. In fact, we were building against some other set of metrics. And the thought was, if we knew what metrics people were going to use to evaluate our product, we would then just get those metrics and create the product around those set of metrics, and we'd have a winning product. So the concept was pretty simple, right? It goes back to very basics, where we're just trying to figure out what are the customer's needs. But the key here is defining what a need actually is. What are those metrics that people are going to use, and how do we collect them in advance? And the other key was, how do we make sure that they're stable from the beginning of the development process to the end? Because we're working on products that took 2-3 years to go develop. So if you get a set of inputs day one, are they going to be valid 3 years later? So that was really the challenge. And that took us down the path of trying to figure out how to make innovation more predictable. So I was working with a small IBM team for about 5 or 6 years, trying to create a better innovation process. And we had statisticians around, we had people that really knew how to do market segmentation. And again, the basics here are simple. We're just trying to figure out who's our customer, what are their needs, which are unmet or overserved or table stakes, and then are there segments of people that have different unmet needs. And the biggest challenge of all this was trying to figure out what these needs are. And that's where the theory comes into play. The key to all of this was figuring out that we could study the underlying process people were trying to execute instead of studying the product. Right? Now, what that allows us to do is to think about process improvement or process techniques like Six Sigma that was becoming popular at the time. And as a manufacturing engineer, that was something that was of interest to me. Statistical process control was big, QFD was big. So we started down this path of defining needs around the underlying process, as we call it. So we go out and study the underlying process. People are trying to execute, figure out how they're measuring success and value, and that was the birth of outcome-driven innovation. So. We practiced that within IBM for a number of years. I took it external when I started my company in 1991, and we practiced it ever since. So when we introduced the concept to Clay Christensen in 1999, we introduced ODI. It was a full-blown practice. We had about 100 successful implementations at the point. And so he liked the concept. He matched it against other things he'd been hearing, of course, as we know the story now, and defined jobs to be done as a concept. Now, what was interesting, in his book, The Innovator's Solution, I don't think anyone really thought that the term jobs to be done would become called a theory. It was just a tiny concept that was much like what Levitt would talk about and things like that. But here we are. Lo and behold, jobs theory becomes the thing that people connect with. So the way I think about it is jobs theory defines the basic tenets of what outcome-driven innovation was born upon, right? There are key elements to this. We need to define needs in a way that makes them stable over time, right? How do we do that? Well, we studied the underlying process or the job they're trying to get done instead of the product or the customer. And the purpose, the reason we're doing all this is because now if we have a stable focal point around which we can define needs, we can solve this problem, right? We can come up with needs that are stable over time. They're solution agnostic. They serve all the purposes that we need in order to create winning products.
But at that time also, it was a lot of focus on the product. Talking about business models wasn't really so much part of the discussion at that time. Or
That's
was
right.
it?
No, it
was
wasn't.
that something that came later?
Yeah, the business model concept, well, I mean, there were business models back then, but it wasn't as popular to talk about that. I think we're still working on just getting products right.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So what would you say most people get wrong with ODI when they try to apply it? Because for an outsider, it's quite a complex process. I mean, even if you read a lot about it and you think through it, applying it in practice is not super easy. So what do you think people get most of the time wrong? Because in your book also that you published recently called Jobs to be Done, you have 84 steps divided into 6 phases. That's a lot of steps.
It's a lot of steps, and the goal there is to lay them out so you can see what we're trying to accomplish, right? But let's simplify it for a second. At a high level, what we're trying to do is to figure out who's my market, who's the group of people, and what's the job they're trying to get done. The second step is getting their needs. The third step is figuring out which are unmet, overserved, table stakes. And the fourth step is deciding, are there segments of people with different unmet needs? Right. So it's basic marketing 101, right? That's all we're trying to do. It turns out marketing 101 is not that easy, right? There are stumbling blocks along the way. So the very first step is defining who the customer is and what is the job they're trying to get done. People stumble there, right? The second step is to define a set of needs. That's challenging as well. When we lay out all the rules, it's just hard to follow them because it's a very different way of thinking about customer needs. When it comes to defining which are unmet, determining which are unmet, it requires market research techniques that are pretty complex. It'd be great if customers had 5 or 10 needs. That's just not the case, right? We have outcomes on the core job, we have related jobs, we have emotional jobs, we have outcomes on consumption chain jobs, we have financial metrics the buyer uses. It is complicated, right? So if we want to understand how all those variables fit into the equation, then we need some pretty complex market research to figure out how to make that happen. And we've worked for 25 years to figure out how to make that happen. And we've simplified it, in our minds at least, but it's still a complicated process.
Has ODI changed a lot since the beginning when you started till today in terms of how you refined it?
It definitely has. The high-level concept's still the same. Right? We're trying to figure out who's the executor, who's our customer, what's the needs, which are unmet, are there segments of people with different unmet needs. But we've developed the needs framework in a much more complete way around right after I wrote my first book, like around the 2005 timeframe. That of course was written in 2003 and 4, right? But we put an article out in MIT Sloan in 2008 that talked about giving customers a fair hearing. And in that article, we released some of the newer concepts. So in the older days, we didn't know that there were consumption chain jobs per se. We said, in the first book, we said that there were jobs, outcomes, and constraints. And the constraints were kind of like a bucket catch-all for everything else. And what we would ask is, if we could execute that job and satisfy all these needs, why would you not buy the product?
Right.
Then they'd give us this other list of reasons, and we're thinking, well, those are these different constraints that they have. Well, it turns out those constraints are really the consumption chain jobs. If it's hard to purchase or install or set up, or it's hard to interface with, then we won't buy it. So eventually we discovered that we should just lay out all these consumption chains and jobs and define them. in a very specific way. So that was one big element. Another key thing that we've done is we've refined the way we define outcome statements. At a high level, you can only get a job done better in one of three ways. You can get the job done faster. You can get the job done more predictably, so there's no variation from time to time. And you can get the job done so there's 100% output or efficiency, so there's no waste. So what that means is if we can eliminate those things that contribute speed or variability or inefficiency to the process, then we could get the job done perfectly. So what we've learned from that is that it's much simpler just to define outcomes as, as removing those things that cause or make it go slow, make it unpredictable, make it inefficient. So we've adopted the language, minimize the time or minimize the likelihood it takes to do these things. And if we could eliminate all those things that take extra time or make it unpredictable or make it inefficient, then we'd get the job done perfectly. So having the outcomes defined that way has really simplified things. It makes it easier to collect the outcomes because we're not using a variety of words to introduce the statement. It's not increase or maximize. It's not reduce or prevent or eliminate. And the other thing we've learned with that terminology is that the need statements are very sensitive to word changes. So I could take the same statement, minimize the time it takes to do X, and say, well, I want to, reduce the time or prevent or eliminate. Those words change the way those statements are rated for importance and satisfaction by customers. And you can imagine if you have a survey with 100 questions in it and you randomly choose different words to start these statements, you're really polluting your research. So we've proven all this, so that's why we don't do that, right? We're very adamant about beginning these statements in a very specific way. And people may argue that, well, it's boring for the customer to read through those statements. Quite honestly, we're paying them to read through the statements and give us answers. We're not trying to entertain them. It's really an exercise in market research where we're getting good statistical data. So we've had to overcome a lot of non-traditional research issues in order to get the kind of inputs that we need to make it work today. So I think those are some of the key areas that we've made changes in over the years. Here's another thing that changed. In the old days, we would take people through the survey, the outcome part, twice. So they'd rate the importance, then they'd come back and rate the satisfaction. And we thought that we'd get better discrimination if we did it in that fashion. But back in the early 2000s, we worked with Microsoft. We did about 40 plus projects with them. And we worked with their corporate market research group. And they experimented with this. And we determined that the best way to do this is the way we do it now, is to have them side by side. We get better discrimination. It's faster. So it met all the variables. It was a no-brainer once we tested it out.
Has this improved the success rate of ODI over the years? Or because I know that you did an independent study of 21 strategy projects that show that you have a 5-time higher success rate compared to traditional innovation methods.
Yeah.
Is it something that has improved the process from that point of view, or is it just easier to run it through as a consultant?
Yeah, it's easier to run it through as a consultant is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
It hasn't wholeheartedly changed the success rate. The goal is to make, as you said early on, we're trying to make a complicated process simple. Right? It's really hard to make something hard simple, and our goal is to keep getting it there. So there's trade-offs that we've made over the years to keep it simple as opposed to going really complex. Just one other example, like with the opportunity algorithm, and we put that out there. It's a very simple concept, right? If a need is important to a large portion of the population, yet it's unsatisfied to most of the population, then we're saying it's unmet. So if it's important and unsatisfied, it's unmet. If it's important and satisfied, it's table stakes. If it's unimportant and very satisfied, it's overserved. There's some very basic things, right? So the opportunity algorithm helps us figure all that out. Is it 100% accurate? Well, it could be better. We know exactly where it could be better and how it could be better. And we could get the accuracy up from 94% where it is today up to about 99%. But to explain how that would be done would be extraordinarily hard. And what we're trying to do is separate the edges, right? what's really important and unsatisfied, what's really important and very satisfied, what's unimportant and very satisfied. Those things are easy to figure out with this equation. It's all the stuff in the middle. Is that one, should it be here or over here or here? The range of error in the middle could be bigger, but those are all for the appropriately served outcomes. So they rarely enter the strategy equation because they're not something that you're trying to cost reduce on or innovate on. So there's trade-offs like that we make. That there's good reasons behind all of this, is what I'm trying to say.
And I was wondering though, since jobs are quite stable over time, and we have a Waxon bot from Sweden in the background welcoming us. So jobs are quite stable over time. Is it possible to buy kind of ODI off the shelf that you've already done with hundreds of clients, these type of ODI processes, and you can get some kind of idea of the market anyways?
The way our clients think about this, they have this data, it's stable over time. They know that they're going to use this set of data for 5 or 10 years to drive their strategy and decisions. So they don't want that data out there publicly. They don't want that data in anyone's hands. It's a guarded secret.
So you write an exclusive with them for a number of years, I guess.
That's right, and it's their data. So we can't go take that data and make it publicly available to everyone in that market to go use. So there is no off the shelf in that sense. We are working on one area that we'll make off the shelf, and I think you guys will like this. But when we think about the consumption chain jobs, one such job is interfacing with the product. Whether it's a mechanical interface or a software interface, whether you're on an elevator, whether you're using a software tool, you're interfacing with some object to make something happen. That's a job, right? And we can study that job generically across all these different fields to see if there's a common set of outcomes that drive what interface with the product really means. So Mike Boyson and I are working on that. We've got our job map laid out. We've got most of the outcomes laid out. We're going to refine that over the next couple of months and make that public as a tool to help UX UI people understand the outcomes associated with the interface side of things, which is different than the core job, right? The core job is going to vary whatever product they're working on, but at least they'll have the information that will help them guide on the UI side.
So this could be relevant also for startups or smaller companies in that sense.
That's right. Or startups who maybe even have something out there they just want to test with their users to see how important are all these outcomes and what's the satisfaction level, so they can see where their UI is deficient along certain outcomes and make improvements.
Anders, I know you have some questions that you would like to ask as well, so I have more, but let you get into it a little bit.
I was thinking about the environment where the job to be done theory, if you call it that, and ODI originated in the IBM PCs. We're talking a lot of cases with medtech and complex technology and so on. Now, would you say that as we progress from that environment and move to more and more towards consumers, and I'm thinking of teenagers, fashion, where feelings, social needs and so on become very important, is there an area where you should be a little bit more careful or deploy ODI in a different way, or how far can you stretch the concept moving from one end to the other?
Yeah, it's not really stretch at all, because in any case, whether you're in the medical space or whether you're on high fashion, there's a core job you're trying to get done with functional outcomes. There's emotional jobs, there's related jobs, there's consumption jobs, and there's financial metrics that the buyer uses. So while in the medical space and more functional products, you can imagine are much richer set of outcomes on the functional side. On the consumer side, you see a much richer set of jobs related to the emotions. So they get included in there. Like you said, they take a higher priority. So you'll recognize that, on the fashion side, the emotional components are very important to the buyer. On on the medical side, doctors rarely would say that, the emotional job is making me feel like, a young kid again. They don't say that.
No.
Or you might need a new doctor. You never know. But so it's a matter of scale. We drew a graphic years ago that had emotion and function, in a matrix, and you have high emotion, high function, with like an automobile, for example. It's something that's highly functional, but it represents you as well too. So if it impacts your persona or sets your persona, then it generally has a high emotional element as well. And then down the right corner, highly functional, low emotion. That's where you see your medical type things. But and then you can have low function, high emotion, which could be jewelry and products like that. But all the ingredients are all the same, right? You just may have more of one ingredient in one situation than another, but the process handles each of those. And we've worked in a lot of these spaces that are high emotion, and a number of ways to innovate is to actually make them more functional, right? So you can position around emotion, but you can create value around function. So if you can figure out, what are some of the other related jobs people are trying to get done while wearing jewelry, or how can you make jewelry more functional, or clothing too? Like you say, material is when you think about people hiking, cold weather, like you do around here in the winter, right? It's a very functional job that you're trying to get done, along with the emotional element. It's got to look good too. So it's a matter of scale. The ingredients are the same. How much of the ingredient goes into each batch is different depending on the market.
And how does one go about on discovering and analyzing the emotional part of the equation? Is that addressed with the same sort of methods that we use on the functional side in ODI, or are there different tool sets or approaches used there?
Yeah, it's really the same approach. Of course, the question's a little bit different, but you're trying to get job statements, right? So we define what a job statement is quite nicely, and you try to get them in that kind of format as well. But generally, there's two forms of emotional jobs. People are either trying to be perceived a certain way by their peer, or they want to feel a certain way as a result of doing that job. And so we capture those statements in the specific formats, and they're stated as jobs, not outcomes. And we don't capture outcomes on the emotional jobs. They're just a series of emotional jobs that you're trying to accomplish while you're getting this core functional job done. And it's true whether we're in market A or market B. Yeah. Okay.
Fascinating. Yeah, I might add another one. I guess you might have seen the movie Lost in Translation.
Yeah.
Because that's an important area. Because now when someone really does the ODI the right way, invests lots of energy and resource into this and gets to the right insights, now it needs to be translated into some form of solution. And we need to make sure that the solution actually delivers, so that it's not like an Apollo rocket where you drop the customer insight and you move on into engineering space. What good examples, how do people go about that, translating customer insight coming from ODI into requirements and solutions, what have you?
Sure. Well, there's certainly a great activity that usually comes about at the end of an ODI project. The first phases that we talked about were just defining who the market is, what the needs are, which are unmet, and other segments of people with different unmet needs. But that's just setting up the data model, right? Now you have all this data to go do things. And one of the first things companies want to go do is to improve their products, right? It's a very natural first step. So we generally work with a marketing, development, planning team. You could call it an ideation exercise, but it's not traditional ideation, because we're not just brainstorming solutions and then testing them later to see if they're wanted. What we do is we present the team with the findings, right? So we'll present them with, here's a segment that exists. They're underserved along these 10 different outcomes, and we need to come up with solutions that address these specifically. So we work together as a team. So we want to know, we don't want to lose anything in the translation, as you say. So we're making sure that the people who are doing the ideation work understand the metrics, their ideas are built around the metrics, and even right after the ideation session, we often do one of two things. You can have customers come in and say, okay, here's the concept. Early prototype stage, it's just a concept written on a board with maybe a little drawing or diagram that says, here's what we're thinking of doing. If we did this correctly, to what degree would it satisfy these outcomes, and get satisfaction ratings from them? Now, of course, it's still hypothetical, right? There is no product, but they're giving you some input, and then you look at that compared to what you got in your research data that said satisfaction was down in this range. Now they're saying it's up in this range. So we're on the right track, right? And then, of course, then you decide to go invest in it, build a real prototype, test it again with customers and so on, and do a more traditional type of concept testing once you've built the product. But that works exceptionally well. I love telling that story of the Bosch team who had 10,000 ideas in their idea database, but they didn't know what to do with them, right? But once we identified the segment to go after and the 14 unmet needs to go target, it took them just 3 hours to come up with a solution. And we see this over and over again. Most of our clients aren't short on ideas. They say we have too many ideas, right? What we don't know is exactly what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So this ties the pieces together so nothing's lost in translation.
So have you come across, I imagine that different kinds of companies have different methods and tools and what have you on that solution side. Have you come across environments and scenarios where there are some factors that are very, positive in taking ODI output and turning them into solutions that really generate and solve the target outcomes, versus others are not as favorable? Do you notice differences there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, necessity is the mother of invention. You've heard that statement before. When a company is losing market share with a product and they have to take some action, they respond quite well, right? Because they see the answer, they go do it, and it works, and that's perfect. In other situations where maybe there isn't a sense of urgency, or you're in a high-tech company that is very technology-driven, and the people just want to see their ideas pushed through no matter what, so they pick your data to justify whatever they want to go do anyway. And we see all that happen as well. You can't control that. What we're trying to do is provide good data and make sure that they use it correctly. Yeah.
You've said in the past that design thinking is a great complement to jobs to be done. Why do you think that, and when would you suggest that you could introduce design thinking into the process? Would it be before or after or during, or how does it match with ODI?
Well, let's just take the sequence of events, right? Yeah. So you have to have a product concept before you develop the concept. And I think about ODI as the innovation process, right? Where it's a strategy and innovation process that helps you conceptualize the winning product. And then when you put it in development, then someone has to go develop the product. Now, ideally, the inputs that this team up here delivers to the development team are going to help the development team as well. And this goes back to the problem that we were talking about earlier, where back in the 80s, the engineers would get these marketing concepts thrown over the wall to them, and they'd have to go figure out how to make them work. So it was the engineers that invented voice of customer out of necessity. And they'd go out to customers trying to figure out how to make this stuff happen. We're seeing the same thing again in the software world, right? Where the product planners aren't necessarily going out and getting all the needs that are necessary to create the winning product. So the UX, UI team is sitting there going, we need better inputs. And they don't know where to go get them. So they're off trying to go get these inputs and apply jobs to be done in ODI to get the right inputs to help them. But the right sequence is for the product planning team to use ODI to come up with a winning concept and to take that set of metrics, deliver them to the development team so that they can go act on them as well. And those inputs become inputs into design thinking.
Okay, but design thinking would start with empathy, going out, doing customer observations and customer interviews. And you're doing customer interviews using ODI, so that kind of would be complementary then, or
It depends where the UX and UI team are focusing. Are they focusing on understanding the core job the customer is trying to get done, or are they working on the interface part, or
Right.
making it easier to set up, install, interface with, upgrade? So
so
generally,
exactly.
the way I look at it, the design team works on executing the consumption elements so that they work perfectly. The planning team should give them the inputs they need to create the right function and put it in the product. That's ideal, right? But it doesn't happen. That's the problem, right? So if the UX UI team is downstream here, wishing they had those inputs, they didn't get them. Now they're back up here. Now the UX UI team are product planners and strategists, and and some are good at that, and some are not. They're two different skills and two different talents. So done correctly, you wouldn't have this problem downstream. The UX UI team would be focusing on design. They wouldn't be focusing on product definition. That should already be given to them. Putting a product into development before it's defined is really a mistake, because you don't know if it's going to be a winning product. You haven't even defined it yet people are off developing it and defining it on the fly. That's the fail fast approach.
Exactly,
Right.
which would be my next question. because you like the idea of design thinking being a complement to ODI, but perhaps less enthusiastic about lean startup as the fail fast, fail often approach. Why is that then? If you can develop that line of reasoning.
Sure. So why would you want to fail fast if you don't have to fail? But think of it like this.
Yeah.
What you're trying to, the reason you're failing fast is because you're trying to quickly discover the unmet needs that exist in the marketplace. You put something up and you go, well, that wasn't quite right. So what does that mean? Well, it didn't satisfy all the needs. Well, what did I learn? I learned that there's 5 more needs I didn't satisfy. So I gather that, and then I go address them and put something back out, and it's like, well, that didn't work either. Well, why not? Well, you satisfied that need, but you took value away from this other one. Oh, I didn't know that was another one.
So you kind of use, you map all these needs up front,
right?
And you have a very good opportunity landscape that shows you the direction. But still, wouldn't there be times when you'd have to iterate, and this is still not going to be enough? There are going to be mistakes made also in that process.
Absolutely.
So Lean Startup could be a way of quickly iterating towards something that works. Because I mean, on the one hand, it's still done as a basis of customer interviews and surveys. It's not actually the customer using the product in the real setting. So,
well, mistakes will be made, but the mistake you don't want to make is mistakenly building the wrong product.
right. Yeah.
Right. So,
which is the idea of Lean Startup as well.
well,
Yes.
right. But so there's 2 parts of that. There'll be mistakes made in implementation, right, and getting the interface just right, or making it easy to install or set up, whatever. But those are, again, the consumption elements, the consumption chain jobs. So, of course, as the designers do that, they'll have to test it with customers and make sure that they're satisfying the needs most appropriately. The tool that I mentioned earlier, having that complete set of generic needs for the user interface, will help with that as well. So we're trying to bring science to both parts of the equation, but each group has to do their job well. The planning team has to do a great planning job. The UX UI team has to do a great development and design job. And if they both did that, this theoretically would work much better. But at the moment, in a lot of companies, as you mentioned, the planning team isn't getting the UX UI team the inputs they need to be effective, so it's forcing them to go become product planners.
But does strategy also help out with that part, that aspect of the actual implementation of the output of the ODI process to get the teams right and the organizational structure and so on and so forth?
Well, right. Well, yes, we do. So you'd be surprised how easy it is once you know what the product concept is and everyone agrees to it. So you have the planning team, the marketing team, the development team all agree that's the concept, and here's why we're building it. Right. We know we're going after that segment of people. They have these unmet needs. Here's how we decided to go address them. All right, go make it happen. Now, everyone shares the same vision, and they know that if they can go design it correctly, they'll have a winning product in the marketplace. It's inspiring and motivating to know that if you hit the target, you're going to win. Whereas, as it stands right now, there is no target, so you just keep iterating, hoping that you're going to win.
Right.
And to us, hope isn't a great strategy.
I might just add that I think it's fascinating what you said earlier, that the people who are the best to implement, or maybe the best to implement ODI and job to be done, are the one who have a very good reason to do so, a sense of urgency and so
Yes,
on.
yes.
Versus large companies with huge resources might not be that motivated all the time. Versus a startup who
Should be highly
really have all the motivation to get it right. ODI should be a perfect match on the motivation side. Then it's a matter of resources and being able to do this appropriately.
Well, you bring up a good point. You're saying that it should be, they should be highly motivated, but they rarely are. So here's why. We've worked a lot in the venture space. We spoke with a lot of venture firms over time, and generally venture firms back an idea and a management team, right? And the people who have the idea are pretty passionate about their idea. They're not looking for someone to come tell them it's wrong or to change it. They want to go put their idea in the market and see if it works. And the venture firms are ready to help them go do that. Spend money, get your minimal viable product out there, go do it, and the market will tell you if you're successful or not. They don't want to wait 2 months, 3 months for some data that's going to tell them what to go build. So I agree with you that the venture community, entrepreneurs, startups should stop and think about how to define the winning product up front before they fall in love with the solution and get funding for it. It's a discipline, and I think people are very motivated to. Well, everyone, people love having ideas, and I think we're all wired that way. We want to come up with the next winning product. We want to be changing the world and making it better, and come up with ways to make it better. So you don't really care about the rest of the science behind it. The science behind it's not much fun. But if you want to make innovation predictable, it's a necessity.
In ODI, you define a job as a task, goal, or objective a person is trying to accomplish, or a problem that they're trying to resolve. Why don't you simply define the job as the goal or objective? Because I'm thinking when you include the word task, you could get confused with task management, but also task in itself is not really the outcome or result that we're trying to achieve, right? That's just the means to get there. So why is task part of the definition?
Well, I think the point of that definition is that a job can be anything that people are using a product for, or it could be anything they're trying to achieve. Right? It could be a task. It could be anything. That's the point. Right? So we don't define it as just one specific thing because it could be anything.
I'm thinking like cutting the grass is a task, but the job is to have the lawn cut. Right, so it sort of introduces an element of confusion. Is it this or that? Because the whole point with the job is the result, the outcome that we're trying to achieve, not how we get there.
Right. Well, let's think about that point of confusion. So, because I see a lot of analysis going on in the social media space that debates what's the right abstracted level of a job, and 90% of the time, those discussions forget the key ingredient. Who's the client that you're working for? Who's the company? Right. So if I'm hired by a manufacturer of lawnmowers to go come up with a better lawnmower, and they want to come up with a better lawnmower, they're telling me they want a better lawnmower.
That's their idea.
Well, they don't know what better means yet, but they're not saying go disrupt my lawnmower market. They're not saying that. Now, someone else in the company might come to us and say that, but if someone comes and says, we want to win in the lawnmower market, then we're going to define the job around what the customer's trying to get done when they're cutting the grass. Now, is that going to help you come up with solutions that will, foresee that bear crop science might use to, have grass that just grows to a specific length and stops? No, but we're not talking to bear crop science at the moment, and we're Bayer too, and they have a different view of what they're trying to do. So you can't define the job in isolation of who you're trying to create the value for, and what company you're working for. And this is why in the Bosch example, I like using the example. It's very simple. You're trying to cut a piece of wood in a straight line. Now, when we went to Bosch, they didn't come to us and say we want to disrupt the circulosome market with some new concept. What they said is we want to enter the North American circulosome market, where the product that will beat DeWalt and Makita and get us on the shelves in Lowe's and Home Depot at the same price point. So we need a product that will get the job done better at the same price point. Help us define what better is. That's where we applied the approach, cutting a piece of wood in a straight line, 80 some odd metrics, the consumption elements that assume a circular saw, right? We know we're building a circular saw, so we're not going to. So we want to know what are the struggles that Makita and DeWalt users are having as they set up their saw and then use it and interface with it and store it and travel with it and so on, because we know it's going to be a circular saw, right? When we pull all the inputs together, then we come up with the right concept, and it wins in the marketplace. And that's what we're trying to accomplish.
So from a philosophical point of view, it should really be the customers who orders and pays for the job to be done analysis, because they would really benefit from having the maximum innovation done in addressing their need.
That is absolutely right. So you can be the lawnmower manufacturer or the circular saw manufacturer, and we have the conversations with them up front. Are we assuming this device is going to have a blade? Well, and the answer is yes, it's going to have a blade. No laser technology. No, it's not going to be laser technology, because what we're trying to do is compete with DeWalt and Makita at the same price point, right? Very clear instructions. So it limits where you're going to go with the concept.
But do you take that then from the client as sort of, okay, the client wants this, let's do it, or do you introduce the possibility of seeing the jobs from a wider perspective and then sort of have that debate with the client before you're?
Well, it's a very short debate because they've already instructed.
But doesn't from your own point of view, isn't it more interesting to work on something that's potentially more disruptive? Or
I like it all. It doesn't matter. It's all fun. It's all challenging. Yeah. But if Bosch came to us and said we want, with that set of instructions, to beat Makita and DeWalt, and we said, well, how about this laser technology? They're going to just throw us out because they already know we don't understand the problem they're trying to solve. Right? And this is what I see in 90% of the conversations online. It's as if they don't understand that there's a client involved in every situation, that you're trying to help them grow a market that they're in generally. So there's 90% of the projects we work on are for companies that are already in markets, and they're trying to come up with a better product, or maybe a brand new replacement product as well. And so when we come up with those core, the outcomes on the core job, they're solution agnostic always. So even when we're cutting wood in a straight line, even though we're making a saw, while the consumption outcomes might talk about a solution, the outcomes on the core job are agnostic to any solution. So we could use those same set of outcomes to brainstorm other solutions later if they wanted to, but they don't want to.
But you've also said that defining the job too narrowly will limit the discovery of growth opportunities, while defining the job too broadly will result in non-actionable insights. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, I'd like using an example of the kettle maker. Kettle maker could go out to customers and say, what do you use my product for? And they say, well, I'm using it to boil water, which is certainly true. And you could go back and try to make a kettle that boils water quickly, right to the right temperature, stays boiling for the right amount of time, whatever. You can figure out all the metrics. But if you stepped a little bit further out there, you'd see that they're using that water as an input to another process, which is to make a hot beverage for consumption, right? So then you get people like Nespresso who've been thinking about this bigger job for years, and they're trying to create a platform-level solution that gets the entire job done, which includes boiling the water to the right temperature. So if you're the kettle maker, if you don't go see what the customer's trying to do with the product in a bigger sense, you can miss out on a bigger opportunity like that. But it doesn't mean that you can't help them make a better kettle as well, right? See, in that kind of case, if we're working with a client like that, we would help them, we would get the inputs to help them make a better kettle, and we'd show them the bigger picture to say, chances are your market's going in this direction because your kettle is just one cog in the wheel, basically. It's one step in getting the bigger job done. So we always look for that as well. But in cutting a piece of wood in a straight line, you'd say, well, that's a part of something bigger too. Well, we're trying to build a house. True. Now, the question would be, do we want to help Bosch create products that build a house? Not in this project, we don't, right? In this project, we want to help get a circular saw on the shelf in Lowe's and Home Depot that will beat them at the same price point. Right? It's that key element that often seems to be missing from the conversation.
So it's a little bit about the company, if they have the willingness and resources to develop in a new direction or not. Because if they're not, then the job will be maybe defined too broadly, and then you have to narrow it down to their core competence. But then there are companies that are looking more long-term, and they say we can move into other areas, and we need to develop competences to be competitive in the future in these other areas that trends are pointing towards.
Sure,
and so on.
that's exactly right. So the kettle maker, we'd point out to them that here's the bigger job, and you could head in this direction. Use your kettle as the initial platform for making it happen, and add features on it that gets more of the job done. Right. So they want to know what can they do to make sure they can improve their existing product in the short term, but where's it going? In other words, their product probably only gets part of the job done, but how can they help them get that part of the job done better? So we'll discover that. But then they want to know what's the rest of the job that customers are trying to get done. So the job map lays all that out. So what we want to make sure we do is we're going to give them information that will help them improve their current product, but then to figure out where do they need to go in the future to own the platform that gets the entire job done.
Right. Because that's really where you build competitive advantage.
Sure, and that's always the case, right? It's that's the case 100% of the time. That's one of our basic concepts, right? That people don't want to have to cobble together the solutions. They want a single solution that gets the entire job done.
Exactly.
Well, the first question is, what's the entire job? And what portion of the entire job does my product get done? And what do I need to do next to get more of the job done? So keep in mind, every competitor in that space is trying to do the same thing. They're all under the same pressure. They are all eventually going to get the entire job done on a single platform, or the winners will, right? Everyone's trying to figure out how to get there first. And they're starting at different steps in the job. Some may be in the execute step, some may be in monitor steps, some may be in the planning steps. But they're all in the market, and they're trying to figure out how to grow. And so whoever takes that entire job and gets there first will disrupt everybody else. And what most companies don't know is, what is the entire job the customer's trying to get done? And how do they measure value along each step of the way? And that's why the job map's so valuable. Once you know that, that's your future. For the next 10, 20 years, you're going to be working on solutions that help you get that, in that direction quicker before your competitors figure it out. It's like the Nespresso thing, right? You're the first to market with a product that gets the entire job done on a single platform. That's disruptive. And Nespresso didn't pull that off overnight either. It took them years in iteration to get it right and fine tune it to make it work.
It would probably help if companies started to define themselves as the job they help people accomplish, and then they might add by, and today they have a certain set of technologies and solutions, whereas that might very well change.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
But today they define themselves as the thing.
By the product.
Yeah, by the product.
Yeah.
Strategy has completed many hundreds of ODI processes with clients, right, over the years, over 25 years. Is it often that you have to go back to the beginning of the process because it was defined incorrectly? If the customer didn't, for example, it was defined too narrow, the job, or too broad, or what have you. Because what I'm trying to get to is it that ODI in itself is sort of an agile process where it's quick to course correct and know when you're going down the wrong path, or is it you might end up doing the whole process and then it's not very useful at the end, the output that you get?
Yeah, you would never go to the end and find out it's not useful. You'd find out, in some of the first interviews, there are things that you can get wrong. You can pick the wrong customer, and some of our clients do that. So, for example, we worked with one company that was pretty certain that their customer was a nutritionist, and it turns out it wasn't. Right? They could look at it much differently and say the real customer is this other person that's getting the entire job done. The nutritionist is getting a piece of the bigger job done, but this person up here is trying to get this entire job done, and you're a cog in this wheel, basically, right? And if you want to help that person get the entire job done, you can't just focus on this one little piece. And so that was course corrected within the first couple of interviews. So we can figure that out pretty quickly. And once you define who the customer is that you're trying to target, and you know what the job is, you're in pretty good shape. Now we do some refinement along the way, like as we create the job map, we may refine the job statement slightly, or as we capture more outcomes, we may refine the job map slightly. But in the end, after we've built the job map and the set of outcomes, we're in solid shape there. So before we do any quantitative work,
Right.
we're in good shape. So we would discover any corrections that need to be made before you get into the quantitative phase.
Have you considered doing a hierarchical job map as well? Because now the job map is step by step within the boundary of the job that's being targeted. Versus we, just a while ago, we discussed that companies will migrate from a smaller job and take a bigger piece of of the big job. So from an understanding point of view, it might make sense to paint the bigger picture and say, okay, this is really the overall job and we're fiddling about here.
Well, the way we think about it is that the entire job is the way we define the job
Okay.
map. And then you may just be in one step currently,
Right.
and you want to move to other steps and getting more of the job done. So it's not hierarchical in that nature.
I was thinking about the circular saw and the house.
Yeah, they're two different markets. So I think this is another point of confusion. Once you go from building the house to the circular saw, you've changed your job executor. It's not a tradesman trying to cut a piece of wood in a straight line.
True.
It's a home builder who's trying to build a home at a profit. Right? So it's a whole different job. You go study and all that.
It goes back to what you said a while ago about a company having set up their mind to address
A market.
whatever need with a certain kind of product within a certain market. Yes,
That's right. Because you don't want to confuse market selection, right? So in a lot of cases, companies don't know what market they want to go after, especially like in a startup or an entrepreneur. They want to. The question they ask is, "What market should we go into?" Well, that's a different question, right? That's a market selection question. So, do you want to go into a market where there's 1 million job executors, or a market where there's 500 job executors? Do you want to go into a market where people are getting the job done 5 times a day, or a market where they're getting the job done 5 times a year? Do you want to go to a market that's highly underserved? You want to go to a market that's highly overserved? Right. So we have this on our website. You can download this. There's 42 different criteria that we use to help pick the market. Right. So you want to pick a market where there's a lot of executors, they're underserved, the consumption jobs have done horribly, and that's an attractive market to go after. So that answers the question of, is that market worthy of going after? And once you make that choice, now you know your executor and your job, and now you do the ODI process to help figure out how to get there.
Compared to Clayton Christensen, who begins by asking about the context when defining the job to be done. In ODI, you introduce context at the very end of the process as part of customer segmentation. And you have these profiling questions that you ask. Why is it important to introduce context at the end of the process rather than at the beginning?
Well, keep in mind what we're trying to do with this phase of the process, at least the way we think about this, is we're trying to discover segments of customers with different unmet needs. So our approach is to define the customer, all the needs, figure out which are unmet, and then run cluster and factor analysis to discover segments of customers with different unmet needs. So now we know we have segments of customers with different unmet needs. Then we ask the question, what's causing them to have different unmet needs? That's the circumstance of the causation effect, right? So we ask it at the end because we want to make sure we know we have different segments of customers that have unique unmet needs. The way the milkshake marketing approach goes about and does it is they're not defining their market as a group of people in a job. They're defining their market as a group of people who are using a product, like milkshakes.
Right.
So there's a group of people who hire milkshakes. Okay, then what they do is they go look for some unique product use case. Well, some people buy them in the morning and some people are buying them in the evening.
Yeah.
And then they go, well, let's take the morning case and then let's study it as a segment, right? It's a group of people who buy milkshakes in the morning. Well, why? Well, because they're going on this long, boring commute and they need something to do with their hands and make the ride more exciting, right? So what's wrong with that is you don't know if people in that segment, that as they define it, all have the same unmet needs or not. you're making a huge assumption because you've never segmented your market around unmet needs. You're just assuming that that segment, as you've defined it as a unique product use case, has a homogeneous population, that their unmet needs are different than unmet needs in other segments, and chances are you're wrong, right? Because you haven't done any of the work to figure out that what you're saying is going to produce a segment of people with a unique set of unmet needs.
Mm.
It's a shortcut, but it's not effective.
Mm.
So.
But what kind of profiling questions do you ask then at the very end to figure out about the different segments? Because you have that at the very end of the process. You have a opportunity landscape, and then you can see the different segments in terms of how unmet these needs are.
Yeah.
So,
and then we have to answer the question why, right? And this is something we've worked on for years.
Mm.
It's a tough one. But here's what we're trying to do. You're trying to figure out the causal factor in advance, and you have to kind of guess at it and put it in the survey, and then see if you're correct. So, what we would do, for example, like when we did a dental project, we talk to dentists and say, okay, so what makes it harder in one case than another to get the job done? And say, well, it could be the proximity of the cavity on the tooth, or it could be that the patient has healthy gums or not, or it could be how big the filling is, or it could be how big a patient can open their mouth and keep it open wide, and they go through all these, we call them complexity factors, that make the job more complex. Mm-hmm. So we don't know if any of these are really the causal factor, but we want to get an inventory of all of them. So we may get 20 or even 30 of them, and they all go in the survey. They're all hypotheses that we're testing, basically.
And that's the same survey as when they are rating the outcome statements. It's not a separate survey.
It's not a separate survey.
Right.
Yeah, so they all go in the same survey. So when we come up with these segments that have different unmet needs, we profile them against all these complexity factors, and we can figure out, like in that case, there were two elements that were contributing to causation. One is if a patient had unhealthy gums and required a large filling, that combination led to the highly underserved segment. Because when you're filling a cavity, if the patient has unhealthy gums, there tends to be more bleeding, so that impacts visualization, so they can't see what they're doing, and then the area is wet with blood. So trying to contour this bigger filling in this situation becomes much more of a problem. As opposed to over here, where the patient has healthy gums and requires a small filling, none of these issues occur, so today's products are over-serving the market. Right? So very different scenario. So trying to guess at that, it's a challenge, and we don't always get it, but if we don't get it up front, what we do is we go do some research after the fact. We discover people who are in each segment, and we know what makes them fall in one segment or not, and then we ask them a whole series of other questions to get at what's really the causal factor.
So you'd have to go back to interviews
and do some more.
Yeah.
We try to avoid that. And we probably have to do that 5 to 10% of the time. So trying to guess it right the first time, we take that as a personal challenge. It's always pretty fun. But it's pretty amazing that you can talk to customers up front to figure out what is making it harder sometimes versus other times. It's easier in a process where, like, it's a dentist who sees different cases, because they can tell you, well, that case is harder than that case for this reason. But in other situations, it's a little more difficult to try to figure out what that causal factor actually is.
But how long time does an ODI process take normally, or is that asking like how long is a rope? I don't know. Depends. Because I'm thinking, you'd probably have a workshop at the beginning with the leadership trying to define the core job and the customer. Then you would have to do the actual interviews. Then you do the survey, and at the end, when you have the opportunity landscape for the different segments, you'd have to talk to the management again about what segment you want to go after. Right? That's going to be your strategy moving forward. So overall, how long time would that take in time?
Yeah, on average it's about 3 months.
3 months. Yeah.
So it's a very specific set of activities that we go through. Like I said, there's typically a workshop up front where we're educating the team and management on what we're going to go do. Typically before a kickoff, we've already gone off and done interviews with customers, because while the company may think the job is X, the customer may think the job is Y, and we want to bring that to the table right at kickoff. So we'll do some initial research before we even get there. We'll validate the job. We'll start a job map, and we introduce that at the kickoff and say, here's the direction that we're going. We get approval, then we conduct lots of interviews. The interviews part is fun too. I have my preference in terms of how to get the interviews done quickly. There's, I guess we'll throw out a few tricks if you want to call them. But my preference is to sit with 2 or 3 people who are key thought leaders in the space, who are subject matter experts. Their customers, they know this stuff inside out. They can talk to you about the subject matter at length, right? And spend 2 to 3 hours with them, defining the job map, pretty good set of outcomes, and get it all started. It's like you're building the frame to a puzzle. Like, you ever sat down to build a puzzle? If you start from the center and build out, it's really hard because you have no points of reference. You don't know where the boundaries are. The same is true here. We need to know what the boundaries are. So defining, the first thing we do is define the job with the customer to make sure we get that. Then we define the job map, and then we define some outcomes for every step. So now we know what the edges of the puzzle look like, and then we do continually more interviews to fill in the gaps in the center until we have a complete set of needs. But doing that interview up front like that for 2 or 3 hours with some experts can get you 50% of the way there, and you can do that in, like I said, in the afternoon. Now you'll want to validate that with more people over the next 3-4 weeks or so. But it generally takes us about a month or so to have a complete set of needs for any project.
Right.
Then we move to the quantitative phase. We build a survey out that has to get programmed, put in the field. We test it, and then that begins. That can be done fairly quickly once it's in the field. A lot of it's done web, sometimes phone, web first, phone to make sure that we've got the right people that we're interviewing, and then we send them to the links. So that finishes up in about 4 weeks or so. Then we begin the data analysis. So that may take a couple of weeks. The teams generally work with us and see what we're seeing. So they see what the segments look like. We start speculating as to why. We look at the causal factors to see if they make sense in explaining why they're underserved or overserved. And then we start building out the strategy. In a lot of cases, the strategy is very obvious. Like, again, I'll go with the Bosch example. It's a simple example, but if you're trying to beat Makita and DeWalt, and there's just one segment that allows you to do that, the strategy is pretty simple, right? There was only one underserved segment. That means you have to go after that underserved segment, satisfy all those 14 unmet needs, and hope that that's enough to differentiate you in the marketplace. So that becomes pretty easy. In other cases, it's not so easy, where you might need multiple strategies. Half the market might be overserved, half might be underserved. You need to take your current product, cost reduce it for this segment, and you need a whole new platform for this other segment. So there's a whole variety of things that can happen there, but the landscape typically points out where you need to go. It's a nice visual.
What about recruiting the customers you need for all these interviews and to do the quantitative surveys? Because we find that it's generally over time it's getting harder and harder to motivate people to really spend some of their time helping guys like us out with insight.
Sure. Well, you have to pay them more.
As simple as that. Write that down.
And we do. So you have to pay pretty handsomely in some cases. For consumer research, generally, for a qualitative interview, we're paying $100 or so. For a physician or electrophysiologist, something like that, you may be paying $450 to sit and chat with for an hour. And that's the cost of getting good information. Absolutely. And the same is true on the quantitative side. On occasion, you have to pay those incentives, and that's what you do. It's the cost of good data.
Right.
Okay, so once the needs-based segmentation is done, and we have these homogeneous and mutually exclusive populations, would it make sense to work our way back towards traditional demographics and psychographics of those populations to see if there are any clear patterns that emerge? Because the reason I'm asking is because a lot of the advertising platforms are based on demographics and psychographics, but not on needs.
Sure. Yeah, and in nearly every survey we include demographic and psychographic questions for that very reason.
Okay.
So they can tie it back to the marketing techniques that they typically use.
Right.
So, yeah, easy enough. There's usually 6 to 10 questions in there that lay out the traditional demographic classification scheme of the marketplace.
That's right.
Yeah, everything goes into one survey. What we're trying to do is you need everyone answering all the same questions so that there's consistency between everyone in your database. So it's a fairly lengthy survey, and I know people criticize us for this too, but again, it's the cost of getting good data. Our surveys are a half hour or more in some cases, and that's a long time. So
but that you pay for as well. So.
Yeah, we pay people to take it, but then people say, well, what about fatigue or bias or things like that? Well, certainly that could be a problem. So we know that between 5 and 15% of the people who will take a survey are somehow, I would say, cheating on it. They're going too fast. They're crisscrossing.
Then you can catch those.
We catch them in real time
yeah.
because we're timing to see how long did it take you to complete that 30-minute survey. Oh, it took you 10 minutes. You're out.
Then you remove that
we remove that out. If there's little deviation in their responses, they get thrown out. If we detect any patterns, they get thrown out. We put trap questions inside there too, where we have a question, say you need to answer this question this way in order to continue. If they don't, because they're just guessing, then they get thrown out. So we know that between 5 and 15% of people taking any survey are going to get tossed out. But it happens in real time. So if we're trying to fill a quota of 300 people, we may have to get 360 people to get to 300. But again, that's the cost of getting good data.
What about the survey program that you use? Is this something that you developed yourself, or are you using off-the-shelf survey programs for this?
Yeah, it's not off the shelf. We've worked with the same number of research firms for a good 20 plus years. So they've developed their own software tools to deploy the surveys. We've tried working like in Qualtrics or something more widely available. Their systems aren't quite where we need them yet in order to deploy them on those consistently. But we're looking for more platforms like that would be more easily reachable by or usable by other parties.
Right. How do you view other people trying to employ ODI without going via strategy? Because I know that a lot of people are very interested in what you do, and they're reading about it and they're trying to do it themselves, right,
sure.
to some extent.
And your latest book helps that happening, actually.
Yes.
Sure. By presenting it.
Sure. Yeah, we encourage that. We want companies to try ODI, and they do. And some are very successful on their own right. They don't need strategy's help. Others call strategy for help, which is great. And so that's one of the reasons we do that, of course. But our goal is to make innovation predictable. That's what we're trying to do as a company. And
but it could also give ODI a bad name if people are trying to apply it and they don't really succeed very well with it, and then it gets confused.
It could.
What you're doing.
Yeah, we don't see that too much though. Quite, thankfully, I think we're prescriptive enough with what we have out there that people are getting the job done better, right? So they're innovating better than they were without it. Now, is it perfect? No, they don't have it perfect yet. But they see it's the right direction. They see it's given them better results, and they can either come to us to help them get it done perfectly, or read more about it, or and we'll make more tools available over time too to help with this. Our goal is to, like I said, make innovation predictable and make ODI the worldwide innovation standard. So we're taking steps to make that happen, and it takes time.
Do you feel it's gaining more momentum now in the last few years? You've been doing this for 25 years. Has it been ups and downs in terms of popularity of what you do?
I wouldn't say it's up and down. I would say it's more of a slow rise with a sudden peak. And I think the peak, of course, is with Clay's introduction of his book, Competing Against Luck. He has a huge fan base, and with tens of thousands of people reading that book, of course, people become aware of jobs to be done. We've had our own fan base for years, not as large as Clay's, of course, but so we've seen this continual rise. But now we see just a lot of awareness about this. So I think the time is right to make ODI the innovation standard practice when it comes to putting jobs theory into practice.
But you're US-based, so most of the work has been done in the US, I'm guessing. But are you seeing more popularity in Europe now around this, or Asia, or somewhere else as well?
Yeah, I see a lot of popularity in Europe.
Yeah.
In other parts of the world too. We get inquiries daily from everywhere in the world. So people are becoming more familiar with it. And this is one of the reasons we chose to give away the book as well, because we can't work with everyone around the world. We're not everywhere around the world, but we want people around the world to become familiar with the practice and the approach and to try it themselves.
Are there any typical key success factors that you notice when people start to deploy it themselves? We talked about motivation being a sense of urgency, but apart from that, are there factors that sort of are very positive towards their ability to pick it up and go?
Are you talking about the client, or are you talking about the consultant or the practitioner?
The companies who use it in their in-house development and want to pick up this ability themselves.
Oh, to develop that internal capability. Yeah. So there are certain factors, I'd say, that make one company more proficient at that than others. It tends to be whether that company has more of a Six Sigma type philosophy and background. We've seen that companies that have black belts tend to pick this up better. They're process-oriented people. They understand the basics. They often understand the research component and all that. And they can adapt this thinking more quickly into what they already know and put it into action. As opposed to companies that don't have that kind of resource, and they don't have a market research department. And even companies that do have a market research department, this is very different. So there's often some resistance there too, because it's flies in the face of a lot of things that people have been practicing for years.
We noticed that, at least over here, that the number of companies who have market research capabilities in-house have diminished, along with the downsizing and right-sizing and so on. And they said that we'll use consultants for that, and then they don't, and they make things up instead.
Not a good approach.
Not a good approach.
I only have one last question. Out of all the questions I wrote down, I don't know if you have any more, but maybe we're thinking more. I was thinking about this, the size of each market segment. You wrote in your book that the cluster analysis step of the ODI segmentation process reveals the size of each segment, which is an important component, of course, when forecasting revenue potential.
Right.
But what exactly do you mean by size? How do you measure that? And also, if the customer has complementary data, such as purchasing power or elasticity of demand or anything else, do you kind of offer a process for combining these different data sets to produce a more rich picture of the opportunity that each market segment represents?
So when we think about the size of the segment and the size of the market, it falls out of the data set. So let's say, for example, we'll go back to dentists. Let's say we have 300 dentists in our sample design, and we know there's 15,000 dentists in the U.S., and we know that the segments broke out, so this segment's 33% of the dentists of those 300. So we know roughly that it's a third of the market, so it means it's 5,000 dentists. So from the size of the segment, you can project to see how big your population is. So that's what we talk about in terms of sizing the market from a numerical standpoint. But then I think you asked the other question from like a willingness to pay standpoint. So we know that some segments of the population will pay more to get the job done better, and other segments won't. So we asked willingness to pay questions. There's a couple of questions that we put in our survey as well. So we can profile each segment to see if it's underserved, is it willing to pay more? Most of the time they are. If they're underserved, they will pay more, but not always. So we recently discovered a segment we're working for an all-terrain vehicle manufacturer where there was an underserved group. There was only one underserved segment, but they weren't willing to pay more to get the job done better, which means that you have to deploy what we call a dominant strategy. You have to get the job done better and cheaper. Now, if you do that, you always win because you're going to get, getting the job done better and cheaper. It's a perfect scenario. So knowing if they're willing to pay more or not is a good piece of information to pick up as part of the survey.
Okay, it's a wrap for me.
Yes.
All right, good.
I guess we're done, right?
Yeah.
It's 5 to 12.
Yeah.